In 753 BC, on the banks of the Tiber River, began the story of a small city that no one could have predicted would change the face of the world. It began more as a legend than a historical account, about twin brothers Romulus and Remus, left for dead after a struggle for the throne. A mysterious she-wolf rescued them and raised them far from humankind. The twins grew up amidst the forests, harboring within them a fierce anger and a capacity for more than a simple life. When they returned to humankind, the conflict between them reignited, culminating in tragedy when Romulus killed his brother and founded a city that bore his name, Rome. And so the story began, a city born of blood and legend. In its early days, Rome was merely a small city surrounded by enemies, living under the rule of successive kings, the last of whom was Tarquinius Superbus, known for his injustice and tyranny. But this injustice was the spark that ignited change. In 509 BC, the Roman people revolted and overthrew the king, giving birth to the Roman Republic, a new system based on the Senate and laws instead of autocratic rule. But this system wasn't entirely fair. Society was divided between a nobility that owned everything, and commoners seeking their rights, leading to a long class struggle that forced the system to gradually change in order to survive. Despite the internal turmoil, Rome was building something even greater, an invincible army. The Roman army was not only the strongest, but also the most organized and disciplined in the ancient world. Soldiers were not merely warriors, but precise and obedient war machines. With this army, Rome began expanding beyond its borders, engaging in endless wars and imposing its dominance on its neighbors, one by one. But the real turning point came with its conflict with Carthage, the great naval power of North Africa, led by the legendary general Hannibal. He astonished the world when he crossed the Alps with a massive army and wore elephants to strike Rome at its heart. This was one of the most perilous moments the Republic had ever faced, and it nearly collapsed. But Rome, with its inherent resilience, emerged stronger, ultimately triumphing and completely destroying Carthage, thus becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Following this victory, Rome expanded at an astonishing pace, conquering Spain, Greece, North Africa, and vast swaths of the known world. But with this expansion, seeds of danger began to sprout from within. Wealth became concentrated in the hands of the elite. The poor grew poorer, and soldiers shifted their loyalty from the state to their commanders. Over time, the republican system began to erode from within. In this vacuum emerged a man who would change history. Julius Caesar, the brilliant military commander who had achieved great victories in Gaul and won the loyalty of the army and the people. But his ambition extended beyond that of a commander. It reached toward absolute rule. When he crossed the Rubicon, it was an indirect declaration of war against the Republic itself, and he entered Rome in triumph to become the most powerful ruler. But absolute power breeds fear, and in 44 BC, his life ended with an assassination in the Senate. However, his death did not restore the Republic. Instead, it opened a new chapter of chaos. New civil wars erupted, with powerful leaders vying for power, until Octavian emerged, defeating his rivals and becoming the first emperor of Rome, taking the name Augustus. With him, the Roman Empire officially began, ushering in a golden age known as the Pax Romana, a period of stability and prosperity. The empire expanded to its greatest extent, stretching from Britain in the west to Egypt and the Levant in the east. Rome was at the height of its power, the undisputed center of the ancient world. Under Octavian Augustus, Rome entered a new era of stability, known as the Pax Romana. Major wars ceased, the economy flourished, and cities prospered. Roman roads stretched out like a vast network, connecting the far reaches of the empire, from cold Britain to the deserts of the east. The average Roman citizen felt proud to belong to the most powerful system the ancient world had ever known. But behind this facade lay a more complex reality. The empire had grown so vast that its administration was becoming a burden. As generations passed, emperors lost the power of the founder. Some were wise, but others were weak or preoccupied with luxury. As leadership at the top weakened, the empire's various parts began to unravel. Rome was no longer a single, simple state, but a world of diverse peoples, governed from a distant center. At this point, tensions began to surface on the borders. Germanic tribes in the north were encroaching on the empire's frontiers, and the Persians in the east were a force to be reckoned with. The Roman army, though powerful, was stretched thin across multiple fronts. But the greatest danger was not from abroad, but from within. In the major cities, especially Rome itself, the gap between rich and poor began to widen dangerously. The elite lived in luxurious palaces, while the poor depended on state subsidies. Politics had become a game of influence, not governance. In this tense atmosphere, a new pattern began to emerge: military emperors. The army became the true power in choosing who ruled. It was no longer the Senate that made the emperor, but the sword. And so began a new phase in the history of Rome, a phase of organized chaos. As Rome entered the 3rd century AD, the empire was no longer the empire it had been in its golden age. Its borders were still vast, and the Roman name still struck fear into the hearts of its enemies. But beneath this surface, its power was slowly beginning to crack. The greatest enemy was no longer on the borders, but within. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century began, one of the most perilous periods in Roman history. In just a few decades, dozens of emperors ascended the throne, many ruling for only a few years, some for mere months before being assassinated or overthrown by the army. The empire had become a battleground. The army, once the symbol of Rome's power, had become the very source of its instability. Military leaders in distant provinces began declaring themselves emperors, each army choosing its own commander and attempting to impose him on Rome. In this chaos, there was no longer any real central government, only a series of internal divisions and conflicts. The borders were under constant attack from Germanic tribes in the north, and to the east, the Persian Empire was pressing down hard. Internally, cities were suffering from inflation, currency collapse, and soaring taxes. Rome was no longer a stable empire, but an empire fighting for its survival. During this period, a number of military emperors emerged, attempting to salvage the situation by force, but each met the same fate: a rapid rise, followed by an even more rapid fall. In time, another emperor arose who would completely transform Rome: Constantine. He moved the center of power to a new city, Constantinople. The center of the empire was no longer in ancient Rome, but in the east, where the economy was stronger and the borders more dynamic. This decision was not merely a change of capital. It was a tacit admission that ancient Rome could no longer sustain the empire on its own. At the same time, a major religious shift also occurred, when Christianity became the recognized religion of the empire, profoundly altering its cultural and political identity. But despite these reforms, one thing was unstoppable: the slow disintegration. By the end of the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire had become a heavy burden on itself. Its territory was vast, enemies surrounded it on all sides, and internal strife was rife. What had once been a single unified power was now a massive entity barely holding its parts together. It was at this moment that the decision that changed history forever was made: the formal division. The empire was no longer governed from a single center, but was divided into two: the Western Empire, centered in ancient Rome, and the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople. This division was not merely administrative. It was an acknowledgement that the empire had become too large to be managed as a single state. In the East, things were relatively more stable, with wealthy cities and thriving trade. In the West, the situation was entirely different: a weak economy, porous borders, and exhausted armies. As time passed, the West began to lose control of its peripheries one by one. The Germanic tribes, which had for years been pressing down the northern borders, began to penetrate deeper into Roman territory. It was no longer just invasions, but waves of migration and conquest simultaneously, gradually dissolving borders. During this period, a young leader emerged who attempted to preserve what remained of the West. Augustus Romulus Augustulus. A young emperor, bearing a grand title but with virtually no real power. The army was no longer unified, and real authority often rested with non-Roman military leaders. The Western Empire had become more reliant on mercenaries than citizens, radically altering the very nature of the state from within. In 476 AD, the moment arrived that historians consider the end of the Western Roman Empire. A Germanic leader named Odoacer overthrew the last emperor of the West, and no one sat on the throne of ancient Rome. But strangely, this end did not come as a single catastrophe, but rather as the result of a long and slow decline, as if the empire had been gradually dissolving without anyone noticing the final moment until much later. Western Rome ended politically, but its legacy did not disappear. The laws, language, administration, and even the very idea of the state survived in Europe for centuries afterward. In the East, the entity known as the Roman Empire persisted, but it gradually transformed into a different identity, later known as the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople remaining the center of power and culture. But for the ancient world, the fall of Western Rome was a shocking moment. An empire that had ruled the world for centuries, dominated the Mediterranean, and built an unparalleled political and legal system was over. Not with an explosion, but with a long, slow, and gradual disintegration. And so, Rome did not fall suddenly, but rather succumbed to history step by step. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, it seemed like the end of an era. Rome itself lost its political prominence, the Western throne was empty, and the ancient world entered a new phase of chaos and transformation. But the deeper truth was different. Rome hadn't died. It had merely changed form. In the West, Europe began to enter what would later be known as the Middle Ages. Strong central authority vanished, and small, fragmented kingdoms emerged, ruled by local kings, many of whom had originally been military commanders or Germanic tribal leaders. Cities that had once been centers of the empire became less important. Trade declined, and the ancient roads built by Rome began to fall into disrepair. Yet not everything disappeared. Roman law, administration, and the Latin language remained the foundation upon which new societies were built. Even when the state fell, the idea of Rome lived on. In the East, the empire continued in a different form. It didn't fall, but rather gradually transformed into a new entity later known as the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople as its capital. Roman rule continued for centuries, but with a different culture and identity. This Eastern Empire saw itself as the rightful heir to ancient Rome, retaining many of its laws and administrative structures, but becoming more closely tied to Greek culture and Christianity. As time passed, Western Europe began to rise again, but this time not as a single empire, but as multiple states that would later evolve into the European nations we know today. But Rome's influence didn't end there. Even after its fall, its legacy remained present everywhere. In modern law, in the concept of the republic and the state, in language, Italian, French, Spanish, and others, in architecture and engineering, and even in the very idea of empire itself. Rome wasn't just a state that ended, it was a civilizational model that reshaped the world. When we look at history today, we discover that the question isn't just, why did Rome fall, but also, how did its influence persist despite its fall? Because some empires don't truly disappear. They transform into ideas that outlive their borders. Ultimately, the story of Rome isn't just about rise and fall. It's about a complete cycle. A small city born from legend becomes the greatest empire in the world, then collapses, but leaves behind an entirely new world. Rome fell as a state, but it endured as an idea.